George Miller, a Vietnam veteran, carried his scars in silence until one cruel remark in a small cafe cut deeper than any wound. Todd, arrogant and dismissive, mocked his sacrifice as if decades of pain and honor meant nothing. But fate had its own plan, and an unexpected voice rose from the crowd to turn the tide. Just wait until you hear how this confrontation ended and why justice at last stood tall. It was one of those quiet Saturday afternoons when life in a small Texas town seemed to slow down. Families strolled the sidewalks after the county fair, children still clutching balloons and half-melted ice cream cones. The cafe on the corner, with its old wooden sign and the smell of fresh coffee drifting outside, was a natural gathering place. Inside, laughter and clinking cups filled the air. George Miller pushed open the door. To most, he looked like any other older man. Gray hair, weathered skin, and tired eyes. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a mixture of dignity and fatigue that set him apart. On his head rested a baseball cap, faded from the sun with the simple words stitched across the front, "Vietnam Veteran." Each step he took was measured, deliberate. His right leg dragged just slightly behind the left, the permanent reminder of a wound earned far from home. Half a century earlier, to him, the limp was nothing new. To the casual onlooker, it might seem minor, but to George, every step carried the weight of memory. He wasn't looking for attention. He never did. All he wanted was a quiet corner, a hot cup of coffee, and a few minutes of peace. He made his way toward an empty table near the window, nodding politely at the waitress who smiled as he passed. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around him like a blanket, a rare comfort. But before he could even settle into his seat, a sudden burst of laughter erupted from a table nearby. The sound was sharp, mocking, and it cut through the cozy hum of conversation. George paused, hand on the back of the chair, his body stiffening just slightly. At that table sat a man in his early 30s, dressed in a crisp suit that looked out of place in the relaxed, small-town setting. His name was Todd Harper, though George didn't know it yet. Todd leaned back in his chair, arrogance radiating from every gesture, his voice carrying far louder than necessary. "Look at this," Todd announced, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Another so-called war hero who thinks the world owes him something." The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Conversations around the room stilled. Forks froze midair. Eyes shifted first toward Todd, then toward George. Todd wasn't finished. He gestured dismissively toward George's cap. "These old guys walk around with their hats like it means something, living off everyone else's hard work and still expecting respect." For a moment, the room was silent. The cheerful cafe atmosphere had turned heavy, as if the very air had thickened. George lowered himself slowly into the chair, his hands steady but his shoulders tight. He kept his eyes on the table, on the steaming cup that the waitress placed in front of him, and yet his silence only magnified the cruelty of the remark. The injustice of it hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Inside every witness and every viewer hearing this story, a feeling rises. Boiling anger. How can someone so casually belittle a man who carried scars for his country? How could such sacrifice be met, not with gratitude, but with mockery? In that moment, George said nothing, but the cafe itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. George didn't answer. His lips remained pressed in a thin line, his eyes fixed on the rising steam from his untouched cup of coffee. For years, he had lived with words like these, spoken in different ways by different voices. Sometimes it was a passing remark, sometimes a whisper behind his back, sometimes outright scorn. And each time, he chose silence. But silence did not mean indifference. Silence was its own kind of shield, worn smooth after decades of use. Still, even shields grow heavy. And now, under the weight of Todd Harper's words, George's shoulders sagged ever so slightly, as though carrying an invisible burden no one else could see. The cafe, which only minutes ago had been filled with the soft sounds of forks on plates and conversations about everyday life, now felt frozen. The people inside didn't know where to look. Some lowered their eyes, embarrassed by Todd's cruelty. Others glanced at George with pity, but no one spoke. Todd saw that silence and mistook it for victory. He leaned forward, his voice cutting sharper, louder, designed to wound. "If men like him hadn't lost that war," Todd sneered, "America wouldn't look so weak today." The words didn't just insult George. They sliced deeper. For him, the war had never been about politics or about winning and losing in the way outsiders measured it. It had been about survival, about brothers in arms who never made it home, about nights spent in jungles where every sound could mean danger, every shadow could hold an ambush. To say lost was to erase all of it. The struggle, the sacrifice, the scars carried both on the body and deep inside. To reduce it to a scoreboard was to take decades of pain and grind it into dust. George's hands curled into fists on the table, his knuckles turned pale, the skin pulled tight. But still, he didn't lift his eyes. He wouldn't give Todd the satisfaction of seeing his anger. Yet inside, a storm raged. Every mocking laugh, every dismissive word echoed with the memory of friends who had given everything and received nothing in return. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. The waitress paused mid-step, holding a tray that suddenly felt too heavy. A child at the corner table looked curiously at the grown-ups, sensing the tension without understanding it. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed louder in that stillness. And for those watching, for those hearing this story, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something sharp, something that cut deeper than noise. Pain. Not the kind you see on the surface, but the kind that seeps into the heart. Every cruel laugh from Todd struck like a blow, not just against George, but against what he represented. A generation that had been asked to sacrifice, only to come home to doubt, misunderstanding, and sometimes outright rejection. The room felt smaller, as though the walls themselves leaned closer, pressing in on George. And though he didn't move, though he didn't speak, his quiet suffering said more than any words could. For the viewer, for anyone listening, the emotion shifts. Anger remains, yes, but now it mixes with something heavier. Sharp pain, a sense of injustice so strong it almost demands release. The cafe held its breath. What would happen next? For a long moment, no one dared to move. The silence hung in the cafe like a curtain, heavy and suffocating. George sat perfectly still, his hands clenched, his eyes lowered, and then from the edge of the room came the soft sound of footsteps. It was Lily, the young waitress who had been watching from behind the counter. She couldn't have been more than 22, with her hair pulled back in a loose braid and a notepad tucked into the pocket of her apron. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried a fresh cup of coffee to George's table. It wasn't part of her order list. She had chosen to bring it on her own. She placed it gently in front of him. For a second, she didn't speak. Her throat tightened. Her heart raced, but she knew she had to say something. She leaned closer, her voice low but clear enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Thank you for your service, sir. My grandfather fought in Vietnam too. I'm proud of you." Her words were simple. They weren't rehearsed. They weren't polished. But they carried a weight far greater than the arrogance that had filled the room moments before. Sincerity has a power that mockery never can match. George lifted his eyes, startled. He had expected more silence, maybe even pity, but instead he saw kindness reflected in the young woman's gaze. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. All he could do was nod. Something shifted in the cafe. A ripple, small at first, like a stone dropped into still water. People stirred in their seats. A man in a work shirt at the table behind George slowly rose, walked forward, and extended his hand. "My brother served there," the man said, his voice steady. "He didn't come home. I want to thank you for carrying the burden he couldn't." George shook his hand, though his own grip trembled. His heart, heavy just moments ago, felt something unfamiliar. Relief. From the corner table, an elderly couple clapped their hands together softly. It wasn't loud, it wasn't for show. It was the kind of gentle applause that comes from the heart, meant for one man alone. Soon, others followed. Not everyone clapped, but many nodded, their expressions shifting from awkward discomfort to respect. Lily stepped back, her cheeks flushed, but in her eyes there was quiet pride. She hadn't just served coffee, she had broken the spell of silence. And in that instant, something remarkable happened. Hope. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, fragile, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. But it was real. The humiliation George had endured moments earlier no longer stood alone. It was met now with recognition, with gratitude, with proof that not everyone saw him through the cruel lens of the past. For the viewer, for anyone watching this unfold, the emotion shifts once more. The sharp pain of injustice begins to soften, replaced by a warmth in the chest. A sense that maybe, just maybe, fairness could still rise in the most unexpected places. In that cafe, surrounded by strangers, George was no longer invisible. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. And that spark, small though it was enough to change everything. Todd shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The confident smirk he had worn moments earlier was faltering. He could feel the atmosphere of the cafe changing, slipping from his control. Where once silence had given him power, now eyes were turning cold, and respect was drifting toward the man he had mocked. Still, he tried one last jab, his voice sharp, his smile strained. "You're all just sentimental," Todd declared, shrugging as if the whole room were naive. "The past doesn't matter anymore." The words fell flat. No laughter followed, no nods of agreement. Only a heavier silence, heavier than before, but this time it did not isolate George. It isolated Todd. Then from the far side of the cafe, a chair scraped back against the wooden floor. The sound was steady, deliberate. Heads turned as a tall man rose to his feet. His frame was straight, his movements precise, the kind that revealed years of discipline. His hair was silver, his shoulders broad, his gaze steady. He spoke, his voice carrying with authority, resonant enough that even those in the back leaned forward to listen. "Colonel James Davidson, United States Army, retired." The weight of the title alone silenced any remaining murmurs. Todd's smirk disappeared entirely. The colonel's eyes swept across the room, then rested on George. With deliberate care, he turned back toward Todd, his words calm but sharp as steel. "Men like Mr. Miller didn't lose that war. They did everything they could. It was not the soldiers who failed. It was the politicians who abandoned them. And if anyone here doubts that, I suggest you look into the eyes of the men who carried the weight of the jungle on their backs and are still standing here among us." His voice rose slightly at the last words, not in anger, but in conviction. The truth in his statement rang out with such clarity that it left no space for argument. And then it happened. The cafe erupted in applause. It began with a single pair of hands, then another, and then the entire room joined, a wave of sound that filled the air with undeniable unity. The clapping wasn't polite. It was fierce, passionate, the kind of applause that speaks for hearts too full for words. George, who had sat hunched in quiet all evening, slowly lifted his head. His eyes glistened, but the tears that gathered there were not born of humiliation. They were born of pride. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence lift. He wasn't forgotten. He wasn't invisible. He mattered. Todd's face burned red. He glanced around, searching for support, but found none. Every gaze he met was cold, unyielding. Whispers of disapproval followed him as he shoved back his chair and hurried toward the door. When it slammed shut behind him, the sound was drowned in a storm of boos and condemning stares. In the center of it all sat George, overwhelmed. He lowered his head slightly, whispering words so soft they might have been missed if not for the silence that fell in their wake. "I thought we'd long been forgotten," dozens of voices answered, strong and unhesitating. "We remember." At that moment, the cafe was no longer just a small-town diner. It was a sanctuary of truth, of gratitude, of justice finally finding its voice. And for George Miller, a man who had carried the scars of war and the weight of neglect for decades, it was more than just applause. It was redemption. For the viewer, the moment is unforgettable. It is triumph. It is inspiration. It is proof that sacrifice, though sometimes overlooked, is never truly erased. Justice had prevailed, and the old veteran knew, at last, that his sacrifice had not been in vain.